So, with Season 2 of Soul Leveling finally kicking off, we are back to our action-packed Shadow Monarch adventure. And Season 2 seems to be taking the solo out of the solo leveling. See, because while Season 1 focuses on Jinwoo's transformation from an E-rank hunter to the player himself, Season 2 more heavily focuses on Jinwoo's role as a necromancer, and more than that, his role as the Shadow Monarch. And thus, with the final episode of Season 1, we saw that Jinwoo began to rise his Shadow Army. And while his Shadow Army does start rather humbly, with a ragtag collection of mages, knights, and Igris the Blood Red, we've now seen in only the first 2 episodes of Season 2 that Jinwoo has started to add a couple of key chess pieces to his ever-growing Shadow Army. Whether that be a collection of ice bears, tank, or iron, Jinwoo's army is making sure that he's not so solo anymore. And this is going to be a trend throughout the continuation of Soul Leveling. Well, yes, Jinwoo is going to make sure that he gets stronger with every coming challenge. A big part of Jinwoo's strength moving forward is going to be his Shadow Monarch ability, the growing of his Shadow Army. And just in the first 2 episodes of Season 2, we have seen Jinwoo add 2 absolutely instrumental shadows into his army. In fact, for the entire length of Soul Leveling, Iron and Tank remain incredibly relevant and powerful shadows. And don't even get me started on Igris. But there is still a whole lot of army to raise. But how does the Shadow Extraction ability work? How are the shadows stored? And do they always stay faithful to Jinwoo? Well, today we're going to be answering all those questions and a whole lot more, because today we're talking Jinwoo's most powerful ability explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. So, is Shadow Extraction truly Jinwoo's strongest ability? Nah, it's kind of up in the air. Jinwoo has an absolutely insane roster of abilities. He has things like detoxification that makes sure if any poisons enter his bloodstream, they're immediately excreted. Longevity, which makes him immune to all diseases or abilities that could be harmful to his health. Stealth, the ability to make himself completely invisible and imperceptible. Quicksilver, which allows him to increase his speed by 30%, and so on and so forth. By far and away, what Jinwoo is known for is Shadow Extraction. But how exactly does this technique work? Why was Jinwoo unable to raise the ice elf leader that he was trying to turn into a shadow at the end of episode 2? Well, let's get into it. See, Shadow Extraction, or the abilities that fall under the job of Shadow Monarch, really has 4 facets. That is 4 separate abilities. And those are Shadow Extraction, Shadow Preservation, Shadow Exchange, and Monarch's Domain. Now, the one that most people probably understand the best is Shadow Extraction. It's a resurrection skill unique to the Shadow Monarch. And yes, I'm saying the Shadow Monarch because there can't be more than one. Shadow Monarch is a lot more than just a job. While multiple people can be necromancers, only one can be a Shadow Monarch, for reasons that I'm not going to talk about in this video because it contains a lot of spoilers for the end of this manhwa. However, I have done whole videos dedicated to the monarchs and the rulers, so if you're curious about what's going on with all that, watch those videos. But the way that Shadow Extraction works is that it allows for the user to raise slain enemies. Whether that enemy is a beast or a hunter, it doesn't necessarily matter. They'll come back as a shadow soldier. Now, these shadows are raised through the usage of a command word. In Jinwoo's case, it's arise. And even though Shadow Extraction does seem like a spell and therefore should require mana if we're going by standard RPG rules, Shadow Extraction actually doesn't require any mana, which is useful when you consider the fact that Jinwoo only ever does this at the end of battles, when he usually has next to no mana. On top of this, as we saw with Jinwoo using Shadow Extraction on all of the knights and mages that he destroyed in his job change quest, Shadow Extraction can be applied over a large radius. It can allow for the user to turn hundreds of deceased beasts or hunters into shadow soldiers simultaneously if they so desire. Because yes, like everything in Soul Leveling, Shadow Extraction gets stronger. The radius gets larger, Jinwoo's able to resurrect stronger and stronger shadows, and so on and so forth. However, even though those abilities sounds ridiculously broken, kind of like Edo Tensei and Naruto, there are some pretty definitive drawbacks. As it's already been established, if there's a massive disparity in stats between Jinwoo and the soul he's trying to extract, there's a substantially higher level of failure. It's like trying to catch Pokemon above your level. However, this isn't the only weakness to Shadow Extraction. The amount of time that's passed since the deceased is being Shadow Extracted also plays a big role in as to whether or not they're going to be able to join Jinwoo's Shadow Army. That is to say that Jinwoo has a substantially higher chance of Shadow Extracting something that just died as opposed to something that died years ago. And this because Shadow Extraction works fundamentally by pulling the mana out of that deceased being and turning it into a Shadow Soldier. soldier, and as mana flows freely through hunters and beasts, and is therefore kind of like a lifeblood of sorts. The reason that this extraction gets harder is because the mana of the deceased person will leak away from their body slowly but surely with time. On top of this, there are some deceased beings that can't be shadow extracted, like 1, non-hunter humans, and 2, demons. See, their lack of mana or the existence of contaminated mana makes shadow extraction impossible. Now, as to why demons have contaminated mana or why they can't be shadow extracted is a bit in the weeds for you to know right now. Demons hail from a place called the Demon Castle, and they're ruled by a guy by the name of Baron, also known as the Demon King. They don't pop up until chapter 57, and considering the fact that season 2 is probably only going to get to about chapter 20 of this story, if that, mind you, these demons aren't something that we're going to have to deal with really anytime soon. On top of this, as we saw with Egress and the head ice elf, shadow extraction can only be attempted 3 times on a deceased being. If you break all 3 of those shots, well, that's never going to be a shadow of yours. On top of that, shadow extraction can't be used on targets that are considered spiritual in nature, and therefore primordial entities such as the rulers and the monarchs, who are essentially the gods of this universe, cannot be shadow extracted, which is good for everyone. And while technically, by the end of the story, Jinwoo is able to shadow extract beings that don't have mana and beings that have corrupted mana, technically the rules state that you can't do it, but the rules don't necessarily apply to Jinwoo or Junho. I'm sorry, Suho. But now that we understand shadow extraction and we know how to make these shadows into soldiers, where are we gonna put them? And to that question, I have one answer and one answer alone. In my shadow, obviously in my shadow. And that right there is where the shadow preservation or the shadow storage ability comes into play. So the shadow storage ability allows for the Shadow Monarch to store any shadows that they've created in their own shadow. And since all of the shadows that belong to the Shadow Monarch are always in its shadow, Shadow Monarch is perpetually able to summon and dismiss these shadows at will. But it actually goes beyond just simple storage. Remember, in the soul leveling universe, everything gets stronger. And when the shadow storage ability hits level 2, yes, there are levels, it also grants the user the ability to share senses with their shadows. Kind of like Nagato with his 6 paths of pain being able to see through the Rinnegan eyes of the corpses that he was piloting around as his 6 paths. And thus Jinwoo as Shadow Monarch eventually gains the ability to have hundreds, if not thousands, of remote monitoring drones anywhere across the globe. Because while the shadows are technically tied to Jinwoo's shadow, they don't have to stay near his shadow. Jinwoo can have shadows on the other side of the globe. So in the hypothetical circumstance where Jinwoo left something like a shadow with his sister, he could keep an eye on his sister even if he was incredibly far away. It goes beyond just seeing. Jinwoo is able to see, hear, and feel anything his shadows are experiencing, which makes this pretty much the best possible reconnaissance tool you could ever imagine. On top of this, there's really no expiration date on how long Jinwoo can store shadow inside of his shadow. When Jinwoo stores a shadow, it enters into a stasis-like state, until whenever Jinwoo decides to summon them back into the world instantaneously, mind you. And whenever that shadow is either accomplished what they needed to do or has been defeated, Jinwoo's able to reabsorb it into his shadow. Did you hear what I said there? Even if a shadow is defeated, it can be reabsorbed, because all of the shadows in Jinwoo's army have an incredibly high level of regeneration. In fact, they can't be killed by normal monsters. Even if their bodies are torn to shreds, once they're pulled back into Jinwoo's shadow, they're completely healed. This means that really the only beings in existence that are able to destroy any of Jinwoo's shadows are rulers and monarchs, the gods of the universe. On top of this, the shadows don't necessarily need to be hidden in Jinwoo's shadow. Jinwoo has a sub-ability off the branch of shadow storage called Shadow Infiltration, which allows for him, or really any Shadow Monarch, to hide shadow soldiers within the shadows of other humans. And while doing this, the shadows hidden in these other people's shadows are able to watch and observe anything that that person is doing. And as Jinwoo is able to share senses with any and all of his shadows, Jinwoo can also be privy to basically anything that that person is doing. But it goes beyond this. The shadow soldiers inside of these other people's shadows are also able to, if Jinwoo isn't sharing his senses with that shadow soldier, send signals to Jinwoo to tell them exactly what that person is up to, especially if that person is planning on doing something like attack Jinwoo. But this isn't the only different way to use shadows, as shadows can also be transformed. See, transformation of shadows is a unique feature even for a Shadow Monarch. See, because the transformation of shadows is only available to a master of the authority over death. Now, the authority over death is usually a term used to talk about Ashborn, one of the monarchs, and therefore becoming a master of the authority over death is really just a fancy way of saying you become the master of the Shadow Monarch role. And once you've mastered this role, the Shadow Monarch is able to turn any of their shadows into a weapon or any item of the master's will. And thus iron could be turned into a shield, Igris a sword, tank could be turned into claws, and so much more. And that's basically everything you need to know about shadow storage and manipulation. But before we move on to Shadow Exchange, I want to talk about the shadows themselves here for a brief moment. See, because while we've established things like the fact that the shadows can regenerate, and in other people's shadows be turned into weapons, called forth immediately and stored back away just as fast, we haven't talked about some of the most important things as it pertains to the shadows. Things like the fact that every single one of Jinwoo's shadows is assigned a grade. And not only does that grade denote their strength, but also how much personality they have. And because of this grading system, there's actually pretty much a confirmed consensus amongst the entire fan base who Jinwoo's top 10 strongest shadows are. Well, I'd say like 95% of people agree on the top 10, 100% of people agree on the top 5, because it's basically laid out to us. But let me lay out to you how these shadows are graded. Now, these different grades correlate pretty well actually to how hunters are graded in terms of strength. However, unlike hunters, a lot of shadows in Jinwoo's army also have the ability to level up their abilities. However, just because shadows are able to get stronger by killing opponents doesn't mean that they're able to naturally transcend to higher and higher grades. They're only able to go to a higher grade with the consent of the Shadow Monarch. And therefore, Jinwoo kind of has to assess the strength of certain shadow soldiers and be like, oh, I guess it is time for you to be promoted, essentially. He's like the boss. Shadow soldiers that are made from particularly powerful deceased beings start at a higher class rank. Kind of like how somebody with a PhD is going to get a better job than somebody with a GED. Now, that person with a GED can absolutely work their way up through the ranks, but that person with a PhD is going to start a little further along. Now, the first and lowest grade of Shadow Soldier is basic grade. These are the weakest soldiers in the Shadow Army and are usually as strong as an E or D ranked hunter. Because of that, you basically never see basic grade shadows. In fact, basic grade kind of just exists in name. Practically, normal grade is basically as low as a Shadow Soldier will go, and that's the next grade above basic grade is normal grade. Now, shadows of this grade are like the foot soldiers of Jinwoo's Shadow Army. Think the knights that Jinwoo used in combat against the Ice Bears. These foot soldiers are usually about as strong as a C-ranked hunter. Now, above the normal grade is the elite grade. Shadows of this grade are by far and away the most common grade of shadows in Jinwoo's army, and they're about as strong as B-ranked hunters. Now, elite grade shadow soldiers and below usually won't have much in the way of personality. While they will be loyal to Jinwoo, you won't see them necessarily expressing emotions. Now, you don't really get to see that until night grade. See, shadows in the night grade are usually about as strong as an A-ranked hunter, and it's not until a shadow hits night grade that they can be given a name by the Shadow Monarch, which means, yes, for those of you currently doing the math, both Tank, Igris, and Iron are all night class shadows, at least currently. Now, above night grade is the elite night grade. These shadows are as strong as basic S tier hunters. There's about as much disparity in the strength of S ranked hunters as there is between A and E ranked hunters. But a good comparison for an elite grade shadow soldier is Baek Yoon Ho, the guild commander of the White Tiger Guild. Now, night and elite night grade soldiers are able to express simple emotions, things like fear or excitement. But it's not until you get to the commander slash general grade that the shadows, one, gain the ability to speak, and two, gain true personalities. Now, commander grade knights are immensely powerful and are able to battle against on even ground against high level S rank hunters. In fact, shadow soldiers from this grade are actively compared in strength to the strongest hunter from the country of Japan. Now, above the commander grade is the marshal grade, which for a long time was the highest grade that any shadow soldier would be able to accomplish. And therefore, any shadow soldiers that are able to evolve to this level are considered the strongest shadow soldiers in the entirety of Jinwoo's army. These shadow soldiers alone are able to contend with the strongest hunters in existence. But when two martial grade shadow soldiers wanted to see who was more powerful, they decided to duke it out. And after one of those martial grade shadow soldiers came out on top, a new grade was made. The Grand Marshal grade, the grade reserved for the strongest shadow soldier in the Shadow Monarch's army. And thus the shadow of this grade serves as the lieutenant of the Shadow Monarch himself. Now, obviously, shadows of this grade have incredibly developed personalities. They have loves, hates, they enjoy K-dramas, and more than anything, they are by far and away the most loyal shadow soldiers in Jinwoo's army. But that's basically everything you need to know about the grades. Next up, we gotta talk about Shadow Exchange, also known as Jinwoo's teleportation skill. Now this technique, like all of the other shadow techniques, doesn't require mana to use. And like with all the other shadow techniques, it starts out rather humbly. See, when Jinwoo first unlocks his ability, he's able to change places with whatever shadow he wants. So let's say hypothetically I'm sitting here in sunny, on fire Los Angeles, but I have a shadow in Seoul, Korea. If I wanted to, I could switch places with that shadow instantaneously. And as his technique technically works with the same mechanism as the gates in the soul leveling universe, Jinwoo is able to take people with him while he uses this technique. Kind of like how multiple people are able to travel through a gate. However, when Jinwoo first got this ability, he would 1, have to have a shadow wherever he wanted to go, and 2, there was a cooldown, which is way too lame for Jinwoo. However, eventually, the ability got stronger, and Jinwoo was eventually able to just teleport wherever he wanted instantaneously with no cooldown. Oh, and did I mention that the ability costs no mana? I did? Good. But enough about definitely not flying Raijin. Let's talk about the final ability tied to the Shadow Monarch, Monarch's Domain. Monarch's Domain is a buff skill specific to the Shadow Monarch. Monarch's Domain allows for Jinwoo to project his shadow over a great area. And any shadow fighting within the confines of Jinwoo's newly extended shadow will gain a 50% status boost. On top of this, Jinwoo gains pretty much complete control over everything that his shadow's touching, which allows for him to alter the terrain, summon shadows, or lay traps. On top of that, Jinwoo's own powers are amplified within the confines of Monarch's Domain, like a monozone or domain expansion or one of the hundreds of other kind of this thing. But the most apt comparison is probably that of the domain expansion, as the Monarch's Domain not only traps who's ever caught in it, but also stops any external attacks from coming in. So, you know, if Shadow Army wasn't strong enough, give it a 50% boost in strength. And with that, that's basically everything you need to know about Jinwoo's job-specific abilities. And hopefully with this tidbit of information, you can gain a better understanding of soul leveling and therefore a greater watching experience. But if you guys have any other questions about the soul leveling universe that you want for me to answer, tell me about them in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I guess I should probably rank the Shadow Soldier, shouldn't I?